It was a late night and the house was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after everyone has settled in for the night. I found myself in a place I never imagined I'd be, standing outside my stepson's bedroom. I had always prided myself on maintaining boundaries, on respecting the space that my partner's children needed. But that night, something inside me shifted. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to join him. He had been struggling with so many things lately: the loss of his mother, adjusting to this new family dynamic, and feeling like he didn't belong. In that moment, it felt like the right thing to do. I quietly stepped into his room, the dim light from the hallway casting soft shadows on the walls. He was fast asleep, his face peaceful for once, untroubled by the worries that seemed to consume him during the day. There was a quiet ache in my chest as I looked at him, a longing to bridge the gap between us, to make him feel seen, understood, and most of all, loved. But was I doing this for him or for me? Could this be my way of trying to connect, to heal some of the loneliness I had been feeling too? As I sat beside him, the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just the physical closeness. It was the emotional distance that loomed large between us. I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing, if I was overstepping. But then, as if sensing my uncertainty, he shifted in his sleep and let out a soft sigh. It was almost as though he was seeking comfort, and without thinking, I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. In that quiet, intimate moment, I could feel the weight of his emotions, his pain, his confusion, his hope that maybe, just maybe, someone cared. It hit me hard. I had always been the one on the outsider trying to find my place in a family that wasn't quite mine. But tonight, sitting there beside him, I understood something. Sometimes boundaries aren't just lines that we draw to protect ourselves. Sometimes they are walls that keep us from truly connecting with each other. I couldn't help but wonder, was I trying to be a father figure, or was I simply trying to fill a void in my own life? I had never imagined a moment like this, and yet here I was, sharing this quiet space with the boy who had become part of my life through the love I had for his mother. The hours ticked by, but I didn't move. I didn't want to disturb the peacefulness of the moment, and yet I knew that this wasn't a sustainable way to move forward. I couldn't keep hiding behind the comfort of silence. We needed to talk. We needed to find a way to understand each other. But how do you approach a conversation so sensitive, so fragile? I slowly stood up, careful not to wake him, and as I left the room, a quiet realization settled in. Sometimes the most profound connections come from moments of quiet, vulnerability, not grand gestures. Maybe this would be the start of a real conversation, the first step in building a bridge between us. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy heart, still replaying the events of the night in my mind. Had I done the right thing? Should I have just let him sleep, respected the space, and maintained that emotional distance? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that sometimes the right thing isn't about following rules. It's about being there when it matters most. As I made my way downstairs, I couldn't help but notice that the house felt different today. It was as if the silence from last night lingered, but there was something new about it. A sense of calm, but also a question. What comes next? Would things be different now? I found myself standing in the kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee, lost in thought. That's when I heard his footsteps. He appeared at the doorway, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at me with a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. "Good morning," I said gently, breaking the silence between us. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice still thick with sleep. I could tell he was processing something, maybe the same things I was. But what I didn't expect was for him to speak first. I remember you being in my room last night," he said softly, his voice hesitant. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know how to respond at first. I had prepared myself for any number of reactions, but not this one. I was expecting confusion, maybe even anger. But instead, there was just a quiet understanding in his voice, as though he was giving me permission to be vulnerable. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," I said, the words coming out more sincere than I anticipated. "You've been through a lot, and I just wanted to be there for you." He nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something more than just the surface tension. Maybe it was trust, maybe it was acceptance, or maybe it was just the beginning of something more. As we sat down to eat breakfast together, the weight of the moment hung in the air. The unspoken bond between us felt stronger, but the tension was still there, thick and unacknowledged. We both knew things couldn't go back to the way they were, but neither of us seemed to be ready to confront it yet. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally on the same page. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was comfortable. The walls between us, the emotional distance that had once felt insurmountable, seemed a little smaller. But I knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy. Healing, trusting, and finding our place in this new family dynamic would take time. But in that moment, as I watched him quietly eat his cereal, I realized that sometimes the hardest part is just showing up. And maybe, just maybe, showing up was all we really needed. Days passed, and while the morning after felt like a small step forward, there were still moments of discomfort. I could tell he was still processing what had happened, and I was too. Every time our paths crossed, there was a lingering awkwardness between us, a silence that felt louder than words. We were both trying to find our new footing in this delicate dynamic, not sure how to take the next step. One evening, as I was walking through the living room, I noticed him sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to his phone. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. I wasn't sure what to say, but I knew I had to do something. The silence between us was almost suffocating. "Hey," I said, my voice tentative, not wanting to overstep, but wanting to reach out in some way. "How's everything going? Anything on your mind?" He glanced up at me, his expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. He didn't speak right away, but after a long pause, he let out a deep breath. "Not much," he replied quietly. "Just stuff." I nodded, knowing that stuff was his way of avoiding what really mattered, but I also understood that it was okay. Sometimes we all need time to process things in our own way, and I wasn't going to force him to talk. Not yet. A week later, something unexpected happened. We were sitting together in the living room watching a movie. It was one of those rare, ordinary moments where everything just felt right. The tension from the past seemed to have faded a little, replaced with a quiet understanding. Then, halfway through the movie, something shifted. He reached over and grabbed the blanket, pulling it closer to both of us. It was a small gesture, but it wasn't lost on me. It was his way of saying, "I'm okay with this. I'm okay with you." I didn't say anything. I just smiled and pulled the blanket over us, feeling a warmth that wasn't just physical but emotional. We didn't need to say anything more. In that moment, the space between us felt less like a chasm and more like a bridge, one that we were both slowly crossing in our own time. The next few days felt lighter. There were still moments of uncertainty, but they weren't as frequent. We had started to find our rhythm. He began to open up more, even if it was just in small ways. I noticed the little things, like the way he would come to me for help, with schoolwork or ask for advice on something. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I knew we still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were both moving in the right direction. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't need to. We just needed to keep showing up, even when it felt hard, even when it felt uncomfortable. And slowly, bit by bit, we were starting to build something real. I had crossed a line that night when I stepped into his room, and I didn't know what it would lead to. But now, looking back, I realized that sometimes the lines we draw aren't meant to keep people out. They're meant to help us understand where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. And maybe, just maybe, the most important thing we can do is to keep stepping forward, even when we're unsure of the path ahead. The following weeks brought more changes, small but significant. We had settled into a new normal, one that wasn't perfect, but it was ours. I found myself looking at him with a different understanding, one that came from seeing him not just as my stepson, but as a young man with his own struggles, dreams, and fears. I realized that this wasn't just about me finding my place in this family, it was about him finding his too. One evening after dinner, he surprised me again. We were sitting at the table, the remnants of our meal still scattered across the surface, when he pushed his plate aside and looked at me, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course," I replied, my voice soft but steady. He hesitated, like he wasn't sure whether he should ask, but after a moment, he spoke. "Why did you come into my room that night?" It took me a moment to process the question. My mind raced, trying to figure out the right words, but there was no easy answer. The truth was, I wasn't sure what had driven me to do it either. It had felt like an instinct, something deeper than I could explain. "I came in because I cared," I said, my voice simple but full of meaning. "Because I wanted to be there for you. I know you've been through a lot, and I didn't want you to feel alone. I guess I just wanted to make sure you knew that I'm here, whether you need me or not." For a long moment, he didn't speak. I watched him closely, waiting for a response, unsure of what would come next. But then, without warning, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement, one that told me he understood, even if he didn't fully express it. That night, as we sat together in the living room, there was an unspoken shift between us. The gap that had once felt so insurmountable seemed a little smaller. It wasn't gone, but it felt more like something we could navigate together. There were still moments of discomfort, but they were no longer the overwhelming presence they once had been. We had both started to understand that family wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, even when you didn't know what to all do, even when things were messy. It was about being there, even when it wasn't easy, and finding ways to communicate, even when words felt difficult. "I think I get it now," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You're not trying to replace my dad, but you still care. And that means something." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to say something profound, something that would make the moment feel even more meaningful. But in the end, all I could say was, "Yeah, I do care, more than you know." And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We weren't there yet, but we were getting closer, one step at a time. As time went on, we both learned to navigate this new dynamic. We still had our moments of tension, moments where the past would creep in and remind us of the challenges we faced. But those moments became fewer and further between, replaced by more understanding, more patience, and more connection. There would always be bumps along the way. There would be misunderstandings, awkward moments, and missteps. But as I looked at him, as I saw him starting to trust me in ways he never had before, I realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but it didn't seem as daunting anymore. And for the first time, I believed that no matter what, we would figure it out. Because sometimes it's not about having all the answers. It's about showing up, being present, and knowing that even in the toughest moments, we're in this together. As the months passed, the relationship between us evolved in ways I hadn't expected. There were still times when the past would rear its head, reminding us of the pain, the loss, and the unspoken things that lingered. But with each passing day, the space between us grew smaller, and the trust between us grew stronger. We found new rhythms in our interactions, simple things, like watching TV together, talking about school, or even just sharing a quiet moment after dinner. These were the things that began to mean the most. The small, everyday interactions that built the foundation of something real, something solid. One evening, I was sitting on the porch sipping my drink and watching the sunset when he came outside and sat down next to me. He didn't say anything at first, but there was something in the way he sat beside me that spoke volumes. It was comfortable, unspoken, but it was a shift I had been waiting for. "I've been thinking," he said after a while, breaking the silence, "about everything, about you coming into my room that night." I looked over at him, not sure what to expect, but I stayed quiet, giving him the space to continue. I think I get it now," he said. "I mean, I didn't understand it at the time, but now I think I do. You weren't just trying to be nice or whatever. You were trying to show me that you cared, that you were there." There was a sincerity in his voice that made my heart swell. It wasn't about him saying the right thing. It was about him finally understanding, letting down the walls he had built up to protect himself. That night, we talked more openly than we had in a long time. It wasn't a deep, heavy conversation about everything we had been through, but it was real. He shared things that he had kept inside for so long, and I shared my own experiences, my own fears and uncertainties. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. We began to understand each other more, not just as family members, but as individuals with our own struggles, emotions, and vulnerabilities. For the first time, I felt like we were truly seeing each other. Not just through the lens of our roles, but as people both with our own pasts, our own pain, and our own growth. I could see the change in him, the way he carried himself, the way he interacted with me. He was more open, more willing to engage. He wasn't just the quiet, distant stepson anymore. He was a young man who had started to trust again, and who was learning to find his place in a family that wasn't perfect, but was trying. One afternoon, as we sat in the living room together watching a game, I felt the weight of everything we had been through settle into a new comfort. There were no longer awkward silences, no more tension in the air. There was just peace. And maybe, for the first time, it was the kind of peace that comes from knowing that things don't need to be perfect to be real. I looked over at him, and he caught my gaze. For a second, our eyes met, and something passed between us. It wasn't a grand gesture or a deep conversation. It was something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement that we had come so far. And in that moment, I realized that we had already built something stronger than I could have imagined. The bond we had formed wasn't perfect, but it was real. It wasn't based on words or grand gestures. It was based on showing up when it mattered, being vulnerable when it was hard, and taking the time to understand each other. It was a bond forged through the quiet moments, the simple moments that truly defined family. And maybe that was all we really needed. A reminder that no matter how complicated things got, we were in this together. As the seasons changed, so did our relationship. We had navigated through awkward moments, emotional barriers, and the unspoken tension that once clouded our interactions. Now we were on a new path, one that wasn't just about surviving each other's presence, but thriving in it. One weekend, we decided to take a day trip to the beach. It wasn't a big thing, just a few hours to break away from the usual routine, but it felt like a significant shift. We had reached a point where it wasn't about the big gestures, but the shared experiences, the quiet moments that spoke volumes. The drive. He sat beside me in the front seat, and instead of the usual silence, we found ourselves talking. It started with small talk, about his plans for the future, his friends, his favorite music. But slowly the conversation deepened. We spoke about things we hadn't addressed before, the tough transitions, the adjustments, the loss, and in those moments, I realized how much we had both grown. "I never thought I'd get used to this," he said, staring out the window, his voice quiet but thoughtful. "Living with you, I mean. It was hard at first." I glanced at him, surprised by his honesty. "Yeah, I get that. It's not easy for anyone, especially when everything changes so fast." But he hesitated for a second, then turned to face me. "But I think I'm starting to understand why you're here, why you're trying." Those words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about his acceptance of me. It was his realization of the effort we both had to make, the effort to be a family. When we arrived at the beach, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the sand. We walked along the shore, each of us lost in our thoughts. But this time, the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It was peaceful, shared. We sat down on the sand, watching the waves crash against the shore. For a while, neither of us spoke, content in the quiet companionship that had blossomed between us. "I used to think that family was just blood," he said, breaking the silence again. "But I guess it's not really about that, is it?" I looked over at him, smiling softly. "No, it's not. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who cares. And sometimes, it's the people you least expect who end up becoming the most important." He nodded, looking out at the horizon. "Yeah, I think I understand that now." In that moment, I realized how much we had both learned. Not just about each other, but about what it really means to be family. It wasn't about titles or bloodlines. It was about the moments of connection, the ones that often went unsaid but were felt deeply. The drive back was quieter, but it was the kind of quiet that felt comfortable, almost peaceful. We weren't talking as much, but we didn't need to. The understanding between us was growing stronger with every passing day. When we got home, I realized that things had changed in ways that were subtle but profound. We weren't just living in the same space anymore. We were beginning to build something lasting, something that wasn't defined by past mistakes or awkward moments, but by the shared commitment to understanding and supporting each other. It wasn't perfect. There were still bumps along the way, moments of miscommunication or frustration, but now we had the tools to navigate them. We had built a foundation that was strong enough to withstand the storms, one based on respect, trust, and the willingness to keep moving forward, together. As I lay in bed that night, thinking about everything we had been through, I realized something important. The most meaningful connections often come from the most unlikely places. And sometimes the most difficult relationships can turn into the most rewarding ones. It wasn't just about what had happened that night in his room. It was about everything that had followed. And in the end, I realized that this wasn't just my journey. It was ours. Months passed, and life continued to unfold in ways both familiar and new. There were still moments when the road felt uncertain, when the weight of the past lingered, but those moments became fewer and further between. We had found our rhythm, a new kind of rhythm that didn't rely on the perfect words or actions, but on shared experiences and quiet understanding. One evening, we sat at the dinner table, eating our meal in the usual way. There was nothing particularly special about the moment. No grand gestures, no heavy conversations. But there was something different. Something I had come to appreciate without realizing it. There was comfort in the simplicity, in the fact that we didn't need anything extraordinary to feel connected. "You know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking about everything, about how much has changed." I looked up, intrigued, but didn't say anything. I didn't need to interrupt. I had learned over the past few months that sometimes the best way to listen was by giving space. "I think I've learned a lot about not just you, but about myself too," he continued, his voice steady. "It's been hard, but I can see now that we're making it work. That we're not just surviving together. We're actually becoming a family." There was a pause as he let the words hang in the air, and I felt my heart swell. In that simple admission, I could hear everything we had both been trying to build. A connection, a bond, a family. As the months turned into a year, we both noticed the subtle changes in our relationship. The awkwardness that had once felt like a constant companion had faded into the background. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was no longer the driving force behind our interactions. One afternoon, we were working together on a project for his school. He was sitting at the desk, focused on his work, while I sat nearby, helping him with a difficult problem. Normally, I would have kept my distance, offering advice only when asked. But today felt different. He asked me a question, and instead of offering a quick answer, I sat beside him and worked through the problem together. It wasn't just about the project. It was about showing up side by side in a way that was natural and comfortable. "Thanks for sticking with me," he said after we finished, looking at me with a quiet smile. "I really appreciate it." In that moment, I realized how far we had come. What had once felt like an awkward, forced relationship had slowly blossomed into something real, something that felt less like obligation and more like mutual respect. The more we shared these quiet moments, the more I understood the importance of patience, consistency, and trust. This wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about showing up every day, even on the days when it felt tough. It was about being present for each other, in big ways and small. That evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, he came into the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe. "I was thinking," he began, his voice a little hesitant, as if unsure of how to continue, "about how we've gotten closer." I turned to face him, smiling softly. "Yeah? What about it?" He hesitated, looking for the right words. "I just wanted to say that I get it now. I get why you've been doing what you've been doing. It wasn't just because you had to, but because you really wanted to be here. And I think I want to be here too." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it meant everything. In those few words, I heard the growth in him, the understanding he had found, not just about me, but about himself, about the kind of person he wanted to be, and about what family really meant. As we stood there in the warmth of our kitchen, the future didn't feel so uncertain. There were still challenges ahead, things we would have to navigate, misunderstandings that would arise. But for the first time, I felt confident in what we had built. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But the love, the respect, the quiet trust we had created in those small, everyday moments was something that felt real and lasting. We had learned to accept each other, flaws and all, and that was what truly mattered. As I looked at him, standing there with a tentative but genuine smile on his face, I realized that the journey was far from over. But the path ahead didn't seem as daunting as it once did. We had started something that was uniquely ours, and it was something worth holding on to. We were family, and no matter what happened, we would continue to grow together, step by step, as we learned from each other, supported each other, and most importantly, loved each other in our own way.